The story begins in a quiet little town. We're treated to a view of streets lined with tall houses, creating a peaceful atmosphere. A limousine glides slowly, carrying a newlywed couple as they enjoy the start of their new life together. The car passes by a small photo studio with a simple signboard. That's where our main character, Brian, works as a pet photographer. Brian's job isn't as easy as it seems. The dogs he photographs often refuse to cooperate, making things complicated. Luckily, there's Tanya, his assistant, who always has unique ways of entertaining the animals. With music and dancing, Tanya manages to bring life into the studio. On the other side of town, we're introduced to Vadik, a Croatian mafia boss. Vadik is having a conversation with the head of the American Migration Services while sipping his coffee. Vadik and his wife already have American citizenship, but their daughter, Masha, doesn't yet. Vadik offers a large sum of money to secure citizenship for his daughter, but the offer is rejected. The officials leave the table with sour faces and a promise to keep monitoring Masha. Vadik then begins to look for another way to solve the problem. Meanwhile, back at the studio, Brian is photographing a client's German Shepherd. The owner insists that the dog will only stay calm if its back is scratched. Brian follows the advice, even though he looks a bit awkward doing it. Tanya, who accidentally sees this, looks puzzled by what's going on. Not long after, the doorbell rings. Brian asks Tanya to greet the next guest, but reminds her not to let them bring any animals into the main hall. The guest is a wealthy old woman with a thick Russian accent. Tanya, engrossed in conversation, forgets Brian's warning. That's when the German Shepherd being photographed notices the presence of a cat in the studio. The dog immediately chases after the cat, causing complete chaos. Brian tries to stop the dog, but the damage is already done. The cat's owner, the wealthy woman, screams in anger, marking the end of Brian's drama-filled workday. After the studio calms down, Tanya approaches Brian with newfound courage. Tanya asks why Brian has never invited her out, even though they've been working together for a month. Tanya even awkwardly suggests that they move in together. Brian, still in shock, doesn't give her an immediate answer. That afternoon, Brian decided to relax by visiting an acupuncture center. However, the calm atmosphere quickly changed when Vadik's bodyguards suddenly barged into the room. One of them, Brick, approached Brian and grabbed him by the neck. After that, they took Brian to Vadik, who was leisurely enjoying a bowl of borscht. Vadik casually explained the situation. Apparently, the cat that was attacked in the studio belonged to his wife. Vadik jokingly said that Brian should be thrown into a lake to pay for his mistake. However, Vadik offered another solution. Brian had to marry Masha so that she could gain citizenship. After a year, the marriage could be annulled, and Masha would marry Brick, Vadik's loyal bodyguard who was like a son to him. Vadik warned Brian not to get romantically involved with Masha. Brian tried to escape, but it was useless. Vadik made it clear that Brian had no other choice. That night, Brian called his mother to tell her about the situation. Instead of sympathy, his mother saw it as a golden opportunity. In her opinion, marrying a wealthy girl like Masha was a smart decision. The next day, Vadik invited Brian onto his private jet. There, Vadik announced that the wedding would take place in 2 weeks. Vadik even handed Brian an engagement ring to give to Masha. Afterward, Vadik asked Brian to step off the plane. It was only then that Brian realized they had been in a hangar the entire time. Brian showed up at the studio that morning as usual, but the atmosphere was different. Tanya was waiting for him, her face filled with anger. Tanya accused Brian of making up the story about his marriage to Masha just to avoid being in a relationship with her. "This is serious, Tanya. I'm really getting married," Brian tried to explain, but Tanya just rolled her eyes in frustration. Tanya finally decided to get her revenge in a way only she could imagine, by causing a massive scene at the wedding celebration. Days passed quickly, and Brian spent his time with Brick. They walked around the studio while Brian recounted his fake love story with Masha. Brick, with his signature cold expression, warned Brian not to do anything stupid that might anger Vadik. That evening, Brian met Masha at a small bar. Masha, fluent in English, began the conversation candidly. "I don't want to marry a stranger either, but I don't have a choice. After my dad tried to bribe the immigration services, things only got more complicated," she said bitterly. In the corner of the bar, Brian noticed 2 men, the heads of immigration services, watching them. Masha noticed too and quickly came up with an idea. "Let's give them a little show," she said, pulling Brian onto the dance floor. They pretended to be madly in love, smiling and laughing with each other. But the officials weren't so easily fooled. They left the bar with suspicious looks. However, the incident didn't end there. Later that night, the 2 men confronted Brian. They introduced themselves as Agents Ross and Plummer. With a serious tone, they interrogated Brian. "We know this is all a ruse. You don't love Masha. Even your story about how you met her doesn't add up," Ross said. Before leaving, Ross handed Brian his card, telling him to call if he ever changed his mind and wanted to help them spy on Vadik. After the agents left, Brian went back inside and found Tanya waiting for him. This time, she was wearing an animal costume, hoping to seduce Brian in a rather unconventional way, but the attempt failed miserably. Brian gently turned her down and asked her to leave, leaving Tanya frustrated. The wedding day finally arrived. Brian tried his best to adapt to the strange Russian traditions, including shouting "bitter" to force the bride and groom to hug. He nervously hugged Masha, while Brick stood in the corner with a grim face, looking like he was about to lose his patience. Vadik quickly stepped in to calm the situation. Meanwhile, Agent Ross and his team attended the celebration disguised as bartenders. When the dancing began, Masha and Brian accidentally interrupted Tanya's speech, which was intended to ruin the wedding. In a state of fake romantic bliss, Brian played the role of a groom hopelessly in love. Vadik, growing irritated, reminded Brian to keep his distance during their honeymoon. After the wedding, Brian and Masha tried to go to Nuka Kiva for their honeymoon. However, a massive storm canceled all flights. Ernesto, an eccentric pilot, offered to help with his small plane. During the flight, the storm turned the journey into a nightmare. Lightning struck the plane, Ernesto's instruments malfunctioned, but they managed to crash land safely. When they arrived at the hotel, everything was a mess. Literally. Brian, Masha, and their belongings were covered in mud. Jokingly, Masha cleaned herself off in a fountain in front of the hotel. Brian couldn't help but be mesmerized, but he quickly reminded himself that this was all just an act. Later, in the hotel room, Masha opened up. "I don't love Brick, and I won't marry him. Once I get my citizenship, I'm going to open a dance studio," she said firmly. Brian started to feel a growing attraction to Masha, but he knew it would only complicate things. To distract himself, Brian went to the bar, hoping to find a moment of peace amidst all the chaos. At the bar, Brian confided in the bartender, admitting that he wanted to impress Masha but had one big problem. He couldn't dance. Hearing this, Lonnie, the bartender, offered to help him practice. They began to rehearse, but unbeknownst to them, Masha saw them. Furious, she confronted Brian, accusing him of ruining her chance to gain citizenship. The next morning, Brian sat in the hotel lobby, deep in thought. His face looked weary, clearly still troubled by his argument with Masha. Lonnie approached him with a new plan. She suggested Brian take Masha to a peaceful and beautiful lagoon to lighten the mood. Meanwhile, back in her room, Masha finally softened. She apologized to Brian and agreed to go with him. They walked through the lush green forest, with Brian snapping a few pictures of Masha. His warm gaze began to reveal unspoken feelings. They arrived at the beach. Filled with excitement, Brian ran into the water. His cheerful laughter caught Masha's attention, who started tossing pebbles at him. In return, Brian took off his shorts and threw them at Masha. She laughed and ran off with the shorts. But suddenly Masha heard a suspicious sound coming from the forest. The mood turned tense. Masha was suddenly attacked and everything went dark for her. Meanwhile, Brian returned to the hotel wrapped in leaves to cover himself. But when he got to the room, instead of finding Masha, he was met by an uninvited Tanya. In the midst of the commotion, Brian's phone rang. A strange voice informed him that Masha had been kidnapped, and Brian needed to provide $10 million in ransom by the next night. Brian was confused and panicked, especially since he was just an ordinary photographer. Meanwhile, Brick, with Vadik's permission, arrived on the island. The hotel bartender gave him information about Brian's adventures, further complicating the situation. Brian, after informing Lonnie and Tanya about Masha's kidnapping, decided to take action. Lonnie suggested they seek help from her cousin, Ernesto. As they planned their next move, Brick suddenly barged in. In the midst of a chaotic chase, Brian managed to outwit Brick, while Tanya and Laney escaped through the balcony. Frustrated, Brick started pursuing them, but Masha was still missing. Lonnie eventually took Brian to her cousin Ernesto. At first, Brian refused to cooperate, but when he saw Brick approaching, he had no choice. They fled into the forest, with Ernesto expertly guiding them through the wild terrain. Ernesto then led the group to his plane. During the journey, Tanya began flirting with Ernesto, making Brian feel somewhat ignored. However, chaos broke out when a scolopendra appeared on the plane, causing an uproar in mid-air. At that moment, they accidentally flew over the location where Masha was being held captive by Ross and Plummer, two heads of the immigration service who turned out to be the masterminds behind the kidnapping. Masha tried to escape, but her attempts were unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Brick informed Vadik about the kidnapping, making Vadik certain that Brian was involved. However, Brian and his team refused to give up. Lonnie suggested they interview local fishing villagers the next day to look for clues. In the meantime, Tanya continued to flirt with Ernesto in various ways, adding a bit of chaos to an already tense journey. The next day, Lonnie received information about two suspicious Americans. She immediately suspected that they might be Masha's kidnappers. Upon hearing that the location required a 2-hour walk, Tanya became annoyed and started complaining. On the other hand, Brian remained optimistic. In a serious moment of preparation, Brian contacted Vadik. He gave Vadik his bank account number in case something happened before 6 p.m. However, Vadik, still suspicious of Brian, immediately reached out to Brick. Convinced that Brian was involved, Vadik entrusted Brick to handle the situation. Elsewhere, Ross informed his boss that there were no signs of their whereabouts so far. Brick felt relieved. In his mind, everything was going according to his evil plan. Meanwhile, Brian and Lonnie were at odds with their teammates who were not taking the critical situation seriously. Frustrated, Brian decided to take matters into his own hands. He armed himself and set out to find Masha. On the other hand, Masha, with incredible bravery, managed to break free from her restraints. Masha outsmarted her kidnappers with clever tactics, surprising them, and then ran to the road. Lonnie, still annoyed with her cousin Ernesto, who kept flirting with Tanya, had no choice but to keep an eye on him. At the same time, Tanya was confronted by Brick, who had found out that Brian was on his way to find Masha. Suddenly, Brian's phone rang. Masha, who had managed to escape, informed him of her location. Brian immediately headed to where Masha had been held captive. However, when he arrived, he was intercepted by Brick. Things quickly turned chaotic, with a shootout that was inevitable. Despite that, Brian managed to outwit his opponent, steal a jeep, and continue his search. Elsewhere, Ernesto, after taking a hard hit to the head that left him a little dazed, realized he had to help Brian right away. Together with Lanny, Ernesto decided to take a helicopter to speed up the rescue mission. Brian finally found Masha. He quickly rescued her using the jeep and then switched to a boat to avoid their pursuers. However, Ross relentlessly followed them. After overcoming several obstacles, the couple reached a remote tribal village where they were able to spend the night and rest. Unfortunately, the place wasn't completely safe. They were found again, and the situation heated up. In the final battle, Brick managed to take out Ross, but then threatened Brian. In a fierce struggle near the cliff, the two men fell from the rocks. Luckily, Brian survived the incident. Ernesto arrived just in time with the helicopter to evacuate Brian and Masha. After landing, Masha tried to convince Vadik to forgive Brian and give his blessing for their marriage. However, Brian firmly refused to be part of such a family. After everything was over, Brian went back to his job as a photographer. But even though Brian tried to move on with his life, his love for Masha never faded. In the end, Brian decided to return, surprising Masha with his presence. The warm smile on her face showed that their love was indeed meant to last.